Some of you have been with us in two previous presentations, and maybe you're new. So I'm Chris Cash, and I volunteered to kind of do a few of these presentations, and we're down to soils. And soils, to me, when I first started to study gardening and plants, I just wanted to learn about plants. And then I had to take a soils class, and like, really, do I need to learn this? And now soils excite me. Soils are like, it's what makes things grow, or not. Like, you can really do a job on your soils. And so hopefully I'll give you a little bit of an idea of how to look at your soils and understand what you have and your impact on your plants and your soils, and how they respond. So one of the things I wanted to do before I got going, I have a PowerPoint we'll go through. We'll stop for questions. One of the things I'd like to do is have people first tell me a little bit about your garden and your soils, if you know anything, or what do you want to know. So I'll just open it up to comments right now. Do you have sandy soil? Do you have rocks? Do you have shallow soil? Do you have water? Is it too dry? Give me an idea of what you think you have or what you want to know about.
I have terrible clay soil that is mushy in the spring, doesn't drain, and turns into concrete in the summer.
Yeah,
I can't grow apple trees on it. I can't. I go through plants like crazy. The ones that survive must be like the uber plants of the world. And I guess I'm looking for ways to just break through this awful stuff.
Called raised planters.
Well, yeah, but that's fine for some things, but I'd like to do some larger land. I have an acre or plus in the backyard, and I'd like to put some trees in, and that's a little hard on a raised bed, I think.
Okay. All right.
I have clay. I also have 2 black walnut trees.
Oh.
Oh,
fun.
Exactly.
Oh, we have, I don't know if it's kind of an old pine barren, but we have pine trees and oak trees, and we have sandy soil. But part of the property behind us is part of a natural drainage area. So we get to some moisture, not too bad, but some moisture in areas, which we managed to use for things that work there. But I'm just interested in how to keep plant matter in the soil, because it seems like it kind of just leaches down through the sand and goes somewhere. I don't know.
Any others want to share?
I also have the really tough clay-like soil, and I've tried to amend it with like black compost mulch and things like that, but it doesn't seem like it mixes in. It seems like, you can still tell where, it's not like a very good mixture. You end up with pockets that get really dry and cracks from the mulch, and then sitting on top of the clay. Even though I try to mix it in, it just doesn't seem to be helping.
Right.
Well, I was going to say that we also have, we're building just north of the Arboretum. We're the lonely house at the end of the road. And, digging to prepare for that house, we ran into, hard pan, and I can't even put a shovel in the ground now. Well, before even, but there's grass growing and weeds growing and all that. But I would like to put in a garden also. But in the result of not getting a shovel in, I bought 4 stock tanks. I'm interested in trying to speed things along a little bit to get something growing. But it is clay and shale.
Wow.
So you're using those stock tanks for raised beds?
Yes.
Hmm.
I'm
All
gonna
right, so
try it. I'm gonna try it.
Yeah.
so that's usually what I hear. I don't hear from like the middle bird down in the valley, like I got great soil. I don't have to do anything. Like
Oh, I'm moving.
so what I'll try to do is I'll try to give you kind of the nuts and bolts of soils, the texture, the structure, how soils are what they are, and see if you can read your soil. And your reading your soil might take you to the, wow, this is really difficult. So, you know, at Landis Arboretum, Fred Lape, when he originally planted it, you know, some folks would say, well, Fred planted things out and he wanted to test to see if they would survive. And me as a gardener, I might have a little Fred Lape type in me in that I plant it out and I don't want to see how it survives. I want it to survive, but I'm not going to baby it. You know, so Landis, if you walk Landis Arboretum's property, there are some really good soil areas. There are some wet, damp areas. There are hemlock areas that are wet, and there are hemlock areas that are dry. Like, what's going on there? Like, so what you can do is you can start to read some of the plant material and some of the soils once you have the knowledge of what is it? What am I walking on? What am I doing when I rototill? So I'm going to run a PowerPoint, and you can unmute yourself whenever you want and jump in and stop me. And I've got a couple of videos. If you can't hear the video, I need to know. I had a little problem earlier. So unless you have some questions for me right now, I'll start with the PowerPoint. Okay. So can you see that?
Yes, very well.
All right. So there's my name. I go by my middle name. My first name's Robert. I got so many people that call me Robert, you know, but anybody that's a middle name person knows what you go through. So anyway, I was a professor at SUNY Cobleskill for a lot of years, but I actually grew up in a nursery family, digging plants out of the ground and learning soils and learning plants from the roots up. And it really benefited me understanding and being able to teach because I started out playing with the ground. So one of the things I want you to go away with today is you as a gardener, you are part of the soil. We're going to talk about sand, we're going to talk about silt and clay and structure and nutrients, but you are a part of the soil because you may be managing it. The picture that I show you here with my watering plants, is that the way to water plants? Actually, no. That's a picture I use to show students how not to water. And we could go through why you would water that way and why you wouldn't water that way. But those little pieces you can start to figure out. The picture here of my putting media into a flat, you put it in loose. After you put that media in, or did you wet the media before, or did you wet it afterward? Did you pack it down? Well, what happens if you just plant it loose versus putting it in loose and then packing it? Same, but so as soon as you pack it, you take away pore space. So your hands pressing it are changing the media. You have just engaged yourself as soil because you made the decision it needs to be compressed to this level. Did you mix peat moss in with it? Did you mix vermiculite in with it? Did you put soil in it? You are a part of the media because you're making the decision of how that soil is going to perform. How deep is the flat? Well, the depth of the flat or the depth of the pot matters to its water holding. So what I want you to come away with is, you know, you're watching the soil presentation and hopefully you come away with that like, oh, I'm actually a part of the ground. Yep. Because if you're trying to garden, if you're trying to grow container plants, you're making the decisions of what the roots are going to be able to go through and do. Do you put fertilizer on now? Do you put fertilizer on later? That's you deciding. So we'll try to engage you as a part of, you're going to be a part of the ground. Okay. What we have to start with first is the word dirt. If you walk into a soils classroom and you say the word dirt, they might throw you out. So what's the difference between dirt and soil?
Dirt's in my house.
Where
Soil's outside.
Where is the dirt in your house?
Oh, all over. I have dogs.
So dirt is not desirable. If you're a gardener and you come through with word, I got dirt at my house and my dirt doesn't grow anything. Well, dirt doesn't grow anything because dirt's not desirable. Dirt has weeds in it. Dirt has diseases. Soil or media is desirable, what you want to grow in, hopefully. So be careful around a soils person when you use the word dirt, because they'll look at you like, oh, there's somebody that doesn't know anything. So, in our previous presentations, we went through what do roots need. And the first one there, roots need oxygen. Roots breathe. They need to take in oxygen, and that allows them to release sugar so that they can grow. If your soil does not have oxygen, like a clay soil, the roots can't breathe. If your soil does not have space for the roots to grow, the roots are not going to grow. Well, then how does the top grow if the roots can't grow? So you need to provide space. We all know roots need water. We know that roots need nutrients. We know that they need the right temperature, but the ones that we key on are roots need oxygen, or they need gas exchange, and they need space to grow. And that's a problem for heavy soils, whether heavy silt or heavy clay. For sandy soil, what's the challenge with a sandy soil? Water.
Water.
Nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
The sandy soil doesn't have much nutrient holding. It doesn't have much water holding. So how do you get those? So roots are opportunistic is the word that you want to keep in your mind, in that I have to provide the root the opportunity that it needs. So if I have that heavy soil, how do I give it the opportunity? If I have a sandy soil, how do I give it that opportunity, and how do I sustain it? So one of the problems with sandy soils is I can't sustain the opportunity because the organic matter decomposes. Organic matter is plants. Okay, organic matter is take carbon as a sugar. It's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. So you take that, and that's a plant. There's other minerals there. But when organic matter decomposes, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, what is left? Nothing. Space. So what happens in a pot that you buy from a store over the year? The media in the pot looks like it's shrinking. Or if you have a raised bed, your raised bed looks like I filled it with really good soil. It has a lot of organic matter in it. It shrunk. Yeah, it did shrink because the organic matter, as it decomposes, turns into carbon dioxide and water, which means space. So you have to continue to have organic matter applied to provide opportunity. Because sandy soil will go back to being a sandy soil, and clay soil will go back to being a clay soil. You're not going to change the overriding, this is what I have. All right, so here we go. Soils provide pore space. Remember I said they need roots, need space to grow. They need room for all these things. So where we're talking about growing is in between all the particles. If this is a sand particle, here's the space. That's where roots grow. They don't grow into rocks. They grow between rocks. Are rocks good in the soil? Actually, yeah, if you take out all of the rocks, you might be decreasing space. So I like to leave everything that's less than an inch in the soil. So I don't disrupt the pore space. So let's talk about some of the things that you would learn in a soils class. Soils develop layers. They develop a profile. So here's the profile that you usually talk about. Soils have a topsoil layer. The first top layer, it's usually dark and it's black. That's where your organic matter is. And it's partially decomposed. Organic matter, maybe fully decomposed, but it's fairly dark. And then you go to a subsoil layer, the B horizon, called the zone of accumulation. And that's where your sand, your silts and your clay, your finer particles will sediment down. They'll move down in the profile. And that's where you start to get those hard pans, and there's clay levels under your sand because you have layering. Layering occurs in all soils. Layering in Middleburg Valley, yeah, really not much. You have 23 feet of topsoil at Guernsey's Nursery and Schoharie Nursery. Underneath that, you have gravel. The Schoharie Creek runs under the nursery. But you have 24 feet of topsoil, 23 feet of topsoil. So they have great drainage. They don't have much fine material to block the pore spaces because it washed down into the gravel in the stream and it gets washed away. And it ends up down in Esperance as clay. So topsoil layer is really what we want to grow in, or we want to mix some of the subsoil with the topsoil to get some depth. So there's my grandson that I talked about earlier. He's got his little digger in his gravel pit in Vermont. That is not my house. My house is, as Inga pointed out, heavy soils. Maybe it grows. So maybe that's Wilma soil, part of the pine bush. But see the layers? You have a top layer that's got organic matter to it. You have a mineralized layer that's, in this case, it's very washed out. A lot of the nutrients have washed through. There's a lot of gravel, a lot of sand, but they have water problems on the property. And it doesn't percolate in some areas. Every layer that you put in can stop water, even if it's sand on top of sand. If you put a fine sand on top of a heavy sand or a heavy sand on top of a fine sand, the water perches on top of the layer. It's really fascinating. And they have groundwater problems. In the spring, the water comes up from the bottom. But what we're looking at for the profile is we're looking for those layers. We're looking for that surface that's brownish. We're looking for particle sizes. How big are the particles? We want to know the color, because color will tell us how much organic matter is there. We're trying to figure out drainage issues. Does it drain or does it not drain? Does it drain too much? And where's the water table? And also, where's the bedrock? Some of you, my property, Landis properties, you got bedrock to deal with. Bedrock can be challenging because you get very, very, very wet in spring. And then what happens in summer? Bone dry. So what do you do as a manager of your garden with the knowledge of, I have bedrock? Well, then you're going to have to turn to, how do I maintain moisture in the season that I need to maintain it in the summer? But I don't want to mulch it in the spring because it's going to be soggy, sloggy, wet. It's called raised beds. It's called raising things up, or don't plant there, or use things that in nature will grow in those areas, which are probably going to be more about mosses and those types of things. All right, here's the soils lecture that you would get in a classroom. The word texture. Texture is particle size. So sand is large particles, silt is medium particles, and clay is very small particles, very small. So we want soils that have sand, silt, and clay in them. We don't want that much clay, but we do want clay. Clay is the nutrient holder. Clay is the water holder. Clay is, I was going to say a sponge, but it's not a sponge because it doesn't spread out like a sponge. So clay expands and contracts. It adheres water. So you want clay in a sandy soil, but in what we call a heavy soil, too much clay is going to bind up all of the air spaces. Remember, we're growing in the pockets between. So one of the terms that you want to familiarize yourself with is the word fines. If I have a lot of fines, very fine sand, fine silt, fine clay, what's the problem with fines? They fill up the pockets. And now I don't have water drainage. I have a lot of water. So if you add fine sand, very fine sand to a soil, you just bound up all of the airspace. If you add fine sand to clay, you just made concrete. In my version of the world, I would not add sand to anything unless I already have a sandy soil. And what would I add to a sandy soil? That's a gravelly sand. I would add fine sand because that would increase the water holding. So the word fines, if you have heavily decomposed organic matter, mucky stuff that you'll get at the bottom of a pond, don't put that in your garden. You can put it in a small amount because it has nutrient holding, but it's very, very fine and it'll block up all the pore spaces. You'll just ruin your garden by putting so much fine material in it. So be careful with very fine material. I'd rather put partially decomposed like wood chips, partially decomposed compost, but very, very, very heavily decomposed may fill up your pore spaces. Now, property like Wilma's, she's like, yeah, that's what I need. So the sandy, gravelly, you need the fines. The clay soil, no way. What we call loam has maybe no more than 20% clay. Loam is what you want. Loam is like sand, silt, and clay at the right proportions. Okay. If you have sandy soil, one of the things on sandy soil is one of the things that works for sand is having the same size sand particles. So why would the same size particle work? Because now you have all these pore spaces that are open between the particles. When you put in mixed sizes of particles, you're filling in pore spaces. So texture is the size of the particle. You're probably never going to change the texture of your ground because if I have a garden that's a big garden, I can't, if I bring in a truckload of sand, now it changes to a sandy garden. But you're not going to change the subsurface soil. You're only going to change where you put the sand. Same with organic matter. You're only going to change the area that you're able to work with, the width and the depth. So structure is the size of the particles. Texture. The other word that you talk about in soils is structure, and the structure is the clumping. So structure is, to me, more important than texture because I can't really change the texture. I can change structure. So structure is how do particles pull together. And things like organic matter, peat moss, has automatic structure. If you take a sponge and squeeze a sponge and put it in water, what's it do? It sucks in the water, and then you let go, and it drains. If you look at a sponge is aggregated particles. It's got pore spaces, it's got water, it's got air. So what happens when you add organic matter to a soil? You're adding a sponge. You're adding air and water in the right ratio. So for me, the answer in almost all cases is heavy soils, add organic matter. Sandy soils, add organic matter. Adding sand is not, to me, an answer. Unless you know what you're doing with that sand. So organic matter, and now that gets you into the conversation of where do I get organic matter? The stores are selling organic matter like crazy these days. You got bags and bags of garden soil and raised bed soils, and it's all different types of compost. Any of it would probably work for you. So aggregating, clay aggregates. If you have no clay, you don't have structure. You just have a bunch of pebbles. If you have only sand and silt, you don't have structure. You just have stuff. So clay will pull together. So actually for a good soil, you want a little bit of clay. You don't want to put too much in because you know you're going to fill in pore spaces. So structure. And then we get to the word friability. Friability is how well aggregated the soil is. Does it have good drainage, aeration, root penetration, water, nutrients? A well aggregated soil, well structured soil. And I gave the example in one of the other presentations of a parking garage, and I'll go through it really quick. But if you have if you think of a parking garages are made of concrete, steel, maybe some wood. Here's your piles, you're building it. That's sand, silt, and clay. Those are the particle sizes. Well, we put them together, now we have a structure. What do you have in that structure? You have space for cars. You have roads, and then you have solids, and then you have open spaces. So what happens when you go through a soil with a rototiller? You break the structure up a little bit or a lot, it depends. What happens when you hit a parking garage with a wrecking ball? You don't turn it into steel and bricks and concrete. You turn it into a pile of rubble that can't aggregate anymore. So be very careful about what you do with your soil. You, as a person, you go in with a rototiller, or you as a person, you go in with a shovel, or you as a person go in and walk all over it. You have horses and cows and everything else walk on the soil. You're compacting it, you're destroying the structure. And how do you rebuild it? Well, good luck with that. What rebuilds soil structure? Organic matter.
Organic matter. Yeah.
So organic matter is kind of like the, if I need something, it's like, I need a pile of organic matter because it'll put my parking garage all back together. It might not work real well, but anyway. All right, so a couple simple tests, and then we'll show you a couple videos I made. Here's a simple test for your soil to analyze what you have. You want soil that's a little bit moist, not wet, not dry. And you do two tests. You do a squeeze test. Take your soil and put it in your hand and squeeze it. And does it turn into this solid ball, or does it crumble apart? That's the squeeze test. In the ribbon test, you're going to take your fingers and you're going to squeeze between your fingers, and you're going to try to ribbon it out. So there's my soil that I squeezed together. there's a ribbon. So what I'm looking for with that ribbon is how far does the ribbon go? If that ribbon's out a distance, I have a lot of clay. If it starts falling apart, it's moist and it starts falling apart, I don't have a lot of clay. I might have a lot of silt. Silt's a little bigger particle. And then you take your fingers and you squeeze the soil between your fingers. Squeeze the soil between your fingers, and you're feeling for the particle size of the sand. And what's interesting about this soil is I think I have heavy soil. You think you have heavy soil. I bet you don't have a clay soil. I bet, well, Wilma's got sand. I bet you have a heavy silt with a lot of clay, but not clay. Clay is not impermeable. When you pick up clay, it sticks to your finger. When you do that ribbon test, it's like the clay that you would make little figures and fire them into a, I can make my cup into a clay item. So my soil, I thought I had a lot of clay, and then I take my fingers and I squeeze it. I have this really, really, really fine sand in our soil, and we have a lot of silt. Silt and a lot of sand ends up being really wet in the spring and then dry in the summer because the pore spaces are filled up. So my drains around the house, they plugged up. I thought they were full of clay. Guess what they're full of? That really, really, really fine sand has gotten in all of my drains, and they're full of sand. And now it's in the cellar drains, roots. Why are the roots there? Sand, water, airspace. They wouldn't be there if there was clay, because the clay is not what they want. So do that little test of squeeze between your fingers and try to ribbon it. There's a friable soil. So ribbon on left is clay, on the right is a good soil. So we're gonna do a little video here of my being in the field, and let me know if you can't hear it.
This is a section of garden that over the years has been rototilled and turned. And now let's see if we can determine how good the soil is. One of the first things is just stand on it. If it feels hard, it is hard. Here's my shovel. It didn't go in. I put my foot on it, it goes in a little bit. But that little shovel test tells me stuff. Here it's been dug up. Large clods. That's called massive soil. No structure. It's been tilled so many times that it just clumps together. I can hardly break it apart. This is a new plot of ground that we're opening for a garden. I dug a small hole. I'm looking for depth, I'm looking for color, I'm looking for crumbliness, or what we call friability. So if we look at what has been dug out already, you'll see it's fairly crumbly with larger clumps, earthworms. What I want to do is I want to do a soil test here to determine what type of soil I have. So pick it up and see how it crumbles. And then squeeze it. It should be moist. And then break it apart a little bit. If it breaks apart, it's dark, it crumbles like that, that's really great soil. If, on the other hand, you find something like this, that's yellowish, you squeeze it and it stays in a clump, that's probably clay. If you squeeze it and it crumbles apart, that's probably silt with a little bit of clay, and it's fairly heavy soil, but it crumbles nice, and that's a good thing. If we look into the hole, you'll see it's yellow underneath. That's a good indication you've probably got a clay and an impermeable layer, so the water's not going to pass through there. So my evaluation of this site is, if we look at the rocks over there, we have plenty of rocks. We have shallow depth, and we have good soil on top. Find the soil at the depth that you want, bring it up and squeeze it. Should be moist. If it squeezes like that, that's not a good sign. Now try to break it apart. If it forms a ribbon, and it ribbons very far out, and this is not ribboning very far out, but it is ribboning, it's got clay in it. If it starts to break, there's a lot of clay there. It starts to break, then it's probably a little more silt, which is a little finer. Then take your fingers and squeeze it tight, the pieces that are there, and you can feel the sand in it if there's sand there. So the sand, silt, and clay components are important. We don't want that much clay. I'll try this soil. It's all brown. Try to ribbon it. No ribbon. Pebbles, sand, nothing fine. So water will go right through that. Sandy.
So that's the major piece of soils, the sand, silt, and clay, and the structure. So do you have any questions before we go on, or keep going? So
Nope, keep going.
I
Yeah,
think
keep going.
I think what you'll find is you'll identify your soil, and then you'll go, what now? So
Yeah.
we already know, I already know this. I know what I have. I have either a clay or I have a silt. You know, Chris said it wasn't a clay, but all I know is it doesn't grow stuff and it's heavy. Or all I know is it's got a lot of sand in it, it doesn't hold anything. Well, that's what you need to know. But a new site, you would want to look at it in a little different way. All right, so we'll go. Any questions? All right, so we'll just go back to the PowerPoint and move along. What time is it? Where are we? All right, so we'll talk a little bit about soil depth here. You want to know how deep the soil is. This is a sandy soil at the beach. Look at the roots up here. They go really deep. Why do they go really deep? There's no fines in sandy soil at the beach. The fines have washed out. The clay has washed out. The silt is gone. It's all sand. And it's all the same size sand. So the roots are like, that's awesome. We can go really deep. You can go to the beach and go, it's really fine sand. Yes, it's really fine sand, but it's deep. Look at this soil. That's down behind my house. That's bedrock. How deep is the soil there? 3 inches. How is that tree growing there? Well, that tree found its way to the cracks where there's organic matter and there's water. This is over at SUNY Cobleskill campus in the new Cantor building. This is prior to planting. New buildings, there's bulldozers. There's heavy equipment all around the building. So what do you know about new building? Everything beneath is compacted. This is rocks. This is when it's dry, it's concrete. So how do you plant around a brand new building? You get rid of all this topsoil, you're still going to have a mess when you bring in new. Here's the trees in front of that building. Those trees are now 7 years old and they haven't grown much of anything. Why haven't they grown much? What's underneath? they put in good topsoil. And when they put in good topsoil, the only place the roots can go is where? Where the good topsoil is.
Yeah.
What could happen in a really good windstorm?
They'll fall over.
It could blow over and just have a pancake root system. But they put engineered soil in here that was a designed soil to have pore space. But there's no way to fix this. You're stuck with that. But if I'm going out to a site, how can I analyze this site to see if where the groundwater is? Well, I would have students go out here with a piece of rebar in the spring and just try to hammer down. And they'd go down about 3 inches, and then they'd find this. Like, oh, there's something underneath it. And then we get a shovel out and we dig, and it's like, oh, there's a layer there. And if it was an old farm field, that would be a plow pan. And the plow just creates this layer. If it's bedrock. So this is what you're stuck with. So how do you grow those trees there? You give them really good soil. You probably grow them in a mound, because here is like a soil that has high bedrock and heavy soil on top of it. It's going to be wet in the spring, dry in the summer. So you almost have to provide hummocks of good soil for the plant to grow in, because there's nothing else you can do other than pile good soil on top of that on a regular basis. Okay. So organic matter, microorganisms, I'm not going to talk much about those because we just don't have that much time. But like I said, you can go to the garden store and you can find all kinds of organic matter, but dark material usually is really what you want. The light material is mineralized soil, probably more sand, probably a fair amount of iron to it. This is my soil in my garden. This is soil that's been turned a lot of years. Why is it so yellow here? I actually went through and I did something called double digging. I went down 2 shovel depths and I brought up the subsoil and I put it on top of the topsoil. So now last year I had just awful soil. But this year when I go in and dig it, I've got my organic layer mixed with a little bit of the silt and clay area. And I'm expecting this year to have a great soil, simply by taking some of the lower soil level and bringing it to the top, double digging. But last year was not a good year because most of it was like this.
So can you explain how, I'm not following the double digging. How was that beneficial?
Well, last year I started to question whether it was beneficial because I brought so much of the heavy material on top.
Yeah.
So because I don't have much organic matter to mix in, I thought, let me try the double digging. And afterwards, I'm like, I just put my body through an incredible workout. If I had a choice, I'd rather put layers of organic matter on top of it and just mix it.
Could you just define what double digging is in case anyone doesn't know?
So what you do with double digging is, here's your topsoil layer. You take your shovel and you make a trench, and you pile your good topsoil in the trench. You pile your good topsoil next to you, and then you dig down another shovel depth, and you throw that on top of that first pile. And then you move over and you dig down 2 depths again. And what you want to do is you want to put the good topsoil in the bottom trench and the poor soil in the top trench. And now, instead of having just a shovel depth of good soil, you're going to have 2 shovel depths of moderately good soil. Because part of what roots want is they want depth. They want the airspace. And what happens over time is the clays and the silts will start to settle to those lower levels. So if you don't want them to settle to the lower levels, what farmers do is farmers use what's called a subsoiler. And if you've ever seen a tractor with very large hooked prongs on the back of it that they drag through the field, they're called subsoilers, and they go down about 18 inches. and they rip through the soil. And what they do is they create an airspace, a channel for the roots or the water to go down through where it was subsoiled. And what it does is it breaks the profile. So this, what you're doing is you're breaking the profile a little bit by just digging a little deeper and mixing the soil. So one of the things you talk about is soil depth. Okay. If you're only growing vegetables, you're growing on a surface. If I'm growing trees, I'm growing deep. Okay. And trees are almost a different discussion. The principle of twos here, that's a great rototiller. It will pulverize everything, but it's a terrible rototiller because it will pulverize everything. Here's a space, again, by a new construction. We all know that goes on by new construction. I can't fix that soil. And that is the soil that the structure has been blown up. So one of the things that's actually been developed at Cornell is something called a scoop and dump method. I think I might have scoop and dump here. But scoop and dump is, instead of using a rototiller, you just take a shovel, you take a backhoe, you scoop it up and you dump it. And if you can leave it sit over winter, it will all find its way to settle out, and you don't mess with it that much in the spring. You go through and you pulverize it. Now you got to be adding organic matter in. If you're using your rototiller and you're adding organic matter in, I'd say that's great. But if you're just using this to loosen up your soil every spring, you're damaging the structure. And you get that. Okay. So most common reasons that you have damage is you have damage to structure. You blow it up. You reduce the porosity by damaging structure because water can't go through a structure that's been blown up. And then you have a chemical imbalance too. If you're adding a lot of fertilizers, a lot of chemicals to your soil, you're damaging your microbes. You're damaging the cohesion of the charged particles. So limit the chemicals that you're using on your soils. Okay. Excessive cultivation, compaction. Don't work the soil when it's wet, and don't work it when it's really dry. It should have some moisture in it. The sun will bake your soil. Put mulch on your soil. The sun will kill microbes. Put mulch on your soil. Flooding and mineral imbalances. That's soil damage. How do we improve the soil? Add organics. It's a short-term fix, though. Like you said, it breaks down over time. You add organics annually, limit your cultivation, improve the drainage, subsurface drainage. If you can get rid of the soil, the water underneath, mulch. And the picture there is a house that, the first house we bought, that's the backyard. When we talked to the realtor, I said to that person, I'm like, so is there a water problem in this area? Oh, no, no, no. And I was like, liar, liar, pants on fire. The trees in that neighborhood were all silver maples. And from my knowledge of plants, silver maples grow in areas where wet in the spring, dry in the summer. That's my backyard. My son came in that day. His boots were stuck in the mud outside. It was just a memorable day. But I knew when I bought the house that I had a high water table in the spring. I also knew there was a swale through the backyard that the water would leave. But I knew that because I knew my trees. Could we fix that? The only way to grow plants on that property was I took and blended a little bit of soil. I did not stay in that area, but over here, I used a little bit of a raised bed, only about 6 inches. And I added compost in. I was able to garden raised. But that soil in that neighborhood was that heavy soil, and the silver maple's roots were everywhere. All right. This is just a picture of peat moss. Peat moss is a resource we shouldn't turn to all the time because we use a lot of it. This is peat moss in Ireland. They cut it out in chunks, which is great because they don't destroy the structure. This is peat moss being harvested in Canada. They use a vacuum cleaner, and then they chop it up into pieces. So what's the difference between this peat moss and that peat moss? Different structure. structures, different sponges.
Hmm.
So even your organic matter, you actually look at it for how chunky are the particles. Oh, I missed something. So let's talk quickly about soil chemistry. Okay, time we got. Next topic is really going to be about fertility. So the terms in your soils, you have something called cation exchange capacity. And CEC is how much nutrient will your soil hold. The sandy soil does not have holding. Sandy soil doesn't have clay. Sandy soil may not have organic matter. So what do you need to add to sandy soils? Clays or organic matters. What's the problem with clays and organic matters? Too much fills up airspace. But we need something to hold on to nutrients. What we usually talk about, though, is the pH of the soil. Is the nutrient available to the plant? And of the nutrients that we talk about, primarily nitrogen is the one factor that we all have to recognize as that could be my limiter. The others, the phosphorus, the calcium, magnesium, yes, they're important, but really for most gardeners, it's nitrogen. So let's talk pH, because this is the one that you can do with your soil. If you do a soil test, to me, the only great value of the soil test is it tells me what balances are there and where my problems are, but I want to know the pH. Once I know the pH, I know how to deal with my soil. If you have a pH between 5.5 and 6.5, do not worry about.
Chris, could everybody please mute your microphones? Someone is picking up something in the background.
Okay, so if you have a pH of 5.5 to 6.5, you don't need to worry about your pH. Unless you're trying to grow plants like rhododendrons and blueberries where they want it more acid, but they'll grow in a 5.5. So 5.5 to 6.5, if I get a pH reading of that, and you can get that done at a garden store, you can get a pH test kit. I really don't think you need the whole full-blown soil test, because when it comes back, you won't even be sure, like, well, how much calcium do I add and where do I get calcium? pH is really where you can make a difference. So if you have pH of less than 5.5, use acid plants. Oak trees like acid, hemlocks, pines like acid, sugar maples, they want sweet, viburnums want sweet, but they'll all grow in this 5.5 to 6.5. So if we can get our pH to be there, that'd be great, right? So here's the pH important piece. If your soils are low, my son in Vermont has a pH of 4. To grow plants in his garden, he adds tons of limestone because he wants to get it up to grow broccoli, and broccoli wants it sweet. So every year he has to add lime. How much lime? He's still figuring it out. So what he's doing is, you probably could, with Cooperative Extension or some of the soil test companies, get a recommendation about how much lime to put down per 1,000 square feet, or you can guess. But you want to make sure you use a dolomitic limestone. And the reason for the dolomitic limestone is you want the calcium from the limestone, but you need the magnesium. And dolomitic limestone, limestone of Schoharie County, has calcium and magnesium in it. If you only add what's called quicklime, calcium oxide or something like that, the magnesium balance will be off. You need to add both of these at the same time to have the proper balance of calcium to magnesium. It's kind of like taking vitamins. You don't just take one vitamin and make your system better in one area and then lose in another area. So dolomitic is the word, right? And then those of us that have very basic soils, my soil on my property is a 7-2. That's really very basic. I love growing rhododendrons. So to grow rhododendrons, I have to add sulfur and I have to add organics if I want those to happen. If I want to grow blueberries, probably got to be adding acid products and acid mulches. And that will not stay. It will change because soils change over time. So because you've got soil that's a massive quantity underneath your feet, you're not going to change all of the pH of the soil. You're going to change where you're treating. And then that's going to change back because all the soil underneath is going to try to go back to the pH that it was. Okay. What usually works for growing plants in your garden is if you look in your neighborhood and what's growing well in your neighborhood, that's what's going to grow well in your garden. What's the great thing about raised beds? Well, raised beds, I get to decide what the media is. Raised beds, I get to decide how I'm going to water it. Raised beds, I can add organic matter and I can adjust the pH and make it what I want. It's not the soil in the ground. Okay? It's what's in the bed. Where is my, I want to go back just a minute, see if I missed something. There was a video that I'm looking for. Guess it's not here. So let's talk really quick about fertilizers. This is a typical fertilizer label. You've seen the numbers 5-10-5 on a fertilizer bag, possibly a 10-10-10 and 20-20-20. Those represent the nutrient analysis. What you want to know is how much nitrogen's there, and the nitrogen that is there is it ammoniacal nitrogen or is it nitrate nitrogen? So this is getting down more to the serious student of soils and fertilizers. But nitrate nitrogen is fast-acting soluble. It'll be around for maybe a month maximum. Once it rains on it, it's going to solubilize. Ammonium is a little slower acting, and that takes bacteria to turn it into nitrate. So this fertilizer has quick acting nitrate, and it has slower acting ammonium. I would probably recommend always looking for a label that has both of those. Okay. The water soluble tells you it will solubilize quickly as opposed to being slower release. But the nitrogen is necessary for all growth. Nitrogen is necessary for all protein synthesis. Nothing happens without nitrogen. So that is the one that leaches out of our soil. It doesn't stay. We have to replace it. So if you're talking about fertilizing, I usually will use a slow release organic. It could be compost or it could be a fertilizer product, but I'll also use a liquid when I want this little charge, because the liquid is going to give it the quick charge of nitrogen.
Right.
You also have in that NPK, 5-10-5, phosphorus and potassium. Phosphorus is actually banned from many fertilizers in New York State now. It's a pollutant. It causes algae blooms in our water. It causes problems. And most soils have phosphorus. Why is it in most fertilizer bags? Why would you put a 20-20-20 down or a 10-10-10? Well, I don't know what fertilizer I need, so I just buy the one that's got everything. You're actually not helping buying a fertilizer with everything because you're causing an imbalance. If you keep applying phosphorus every year, phosphorus binds to the soil. Nitrogen washes through. So which should you be applying? Nitrogen. Don't apply phosphorus unless you need it. And that would be a soil test. Potassium, on the other hand, potassium leaches out. Your wood ashes have potassium in them. Potassium is kind of interesting to me because if you've been to the doctor, all doctors say, drink more water, drink more water, drink more water. Well, potassium helps with water movement through a plant. And when I taught greenhouse crops, the interesting thing to me was I could walk into a greenhouse in the morning, and if my plants weren't looking too well, in some cases they go, oh, you got a little potassium deficiency this morning, because the potassium was necessary for a good cuticle, like your skin. So if plants are looking a bit dull, maybe you got a little potassium deficiency. Almost all fertilizers have potassium in them, okay? The ones that a lot of gardeners deal with are iron. And iron causes, lack of iron causes green veins and yellow between the veins. Green veins, yellow between the veins, that's iron deficiency. And that's a pH problem. The soil is too sweet or too sour. So you change the pH and you'll get iron. Or you can add iron, but if you keep adding iron, you're going to have manganese or other problems. So work with pH. And calcium's necessary for cell walls. Those people that grow tomatoes and they get cracks on the bottom of tomatoes, it's a calcium problem. So that's a case of just know your plant. Calcium, we don't have a calcium problem on my property because we have limestone. Fertilizers. What is plant food? If you've been with me for the other two presentations, hopefully you learned that plant food is not fertilizer. Plants make their own food, and that's sugar, and that gives them energy. What are fertilizers? Fertilizers are actually nutrients. They're the building blocks. We need calcium for cell walls. We need magnesium for photosynthesis to run, but what runs it is sugar. Let me go back to that. We'll keep going. Liquids versus granulars. So one of the things you might look at when you're buying fertilizers, I think you're probably familiar with Miracle-Gro. Miracle-Gro is just a brand name. I think Scott's company now owns the name Miracle-Gro. It's just a brand name. But we can buy Miracle-Gro in two forms. We can buy general purpose and acid-loving plant formulas. Those are liquid. They come in as a blue powder. You mix them with water. So general purpose is for the average soil, 6.5, 5.5 pH. What's acid loving? That's a fertilizer for my blueberries and my rhododendrons and those plants, acid loving plants. Okay. So those are the two I would be looking for, the acid loving or the general purpose. General purpose for higher pH, acid loving for I need acid on this plant. Granular forms, we have plant tone and holly-tone. What's the difference? Plant tone is a product for general garden. Holly-tone, more acid soil, acid-loving plants. So should Wilma use holly-tone in her property? Probably not. She's probably got very acid soils. Probably plant tone because the soil's already acid. And then the word slow release. Slow release is a term that lets you know nitrogen, only nitrogen is released over a long period of time. So when you buy a fertilizer that says 50% slow release, that means if there's a 10% nitrogen, 5% is released right away, 5% will be over time. Should you use a general fertilizer or organic fertilizer? Like I said, I use both. The general fertilizers are cheap. You get a lot of fertilizer, like a 20-20-20 or 15-15-15, you get a lot. They're fast working. Why would you pick an organic? Well, the reason for the organic is the organics deliver the broad spectrum holistic product. They deliver things like humic acid, they deliver seaweed complexes that you have carbon-based products that will break down over time, and they contribute to soil health of microbes, of structural building, a whole lot of benefit, but they don't have much nitrogen. So when you use organic fertilizers, you're not getting a nitrogen kick. You're getting a soil improvement. You're getting a structural improvement. You're getting a holistic treatment of your soil. So I use both. I use the nitrogen kick of the general one, And then I use the complex because I want my microbe environment, I want my structure. So that's a question I get a lot of people ask, like, why should I use them? They're expensive and there's almost no nutrient in them. That's true. But there's a long-lasting benefit. So here's a general fertilizer bag, 3204. Holy mackerel, 32% nitrogen. That's really high. You'll burn your plants if you put much of that on. Ammoniacal, urea, soluble, only 0.5% soluble. So this has 31.5% soluble nitrogen. You put it down, you water it, zoom, you burn your roots if you put a lot of it down. 533, really? There's not much nutrient in it, but hydrolyzed feather meal, pasteurized poultry manure, cocoa meal, bone meal, all complexes that are good for soil microbes and soil structure. That's why you use it. So here's your organic one. Biologics, I'm not going to talk much about biologics other than for legumes, we need legume rhizobium bacterium working with beans, peas to help their roots grow. They bring in nitrogen to the plant. So where you have legumes, you really don't need great nitrogen in the soil because the roots will, bacteria will bring it in. Mycorrhiza, you hear a lot about mycorrhiza today. You can buy mycorrhiza formulations. I really don't recommend them. You have a pin oak that's growing poorly, and I think it might be a micro problem. You know what I do? I find a pin oak that's growing really well. I dig up some of the soil from a pin oak that's growing really well. And I take it back to my pin oak that's not doing well, and I mix it in with the soil. And what did I just do to the soil? I just inoculated it with the microbes from the good pin oak, and maybe my pin oak that's not doing well just needs a little kick of inoculum from, because mycorrhiza are species of fungi. So if you have the wrong species, I put a pine mycorrhiza on an oak, well, that doesn't work because they're root specific. So find a tree that has really good soil and a really healthy tree, and maybe you can mix it in. But if you just sprinkle the soil on the top of the ground, guess what happens? Take the good soil, put it around a pin oak that's poor. The sun is going to kill all the microbes. So you either mix it in with the soil or you put mulch over top of it, but you do not let the sun kill off the microbes. You make sure they're covered up. Mulch, I was going to talk about mulch a little bit, but I think we're starting to move on in time. So mulchers are just really, really, really important. They add organic matter. They can actually hold on to nutrients. They reduce weeds. The soil will actually improve the structure. If it's an organic mulch, some of the humic acids and other things will leach down into your soil and actually improve the structure of the soil. They won't let the clay crack the soil. But you have some problems with mulches. If you put them on really thick, like 6 inches, they'll take nitrogen out of the soil for decomposition. So don't put them on really, really thick. Don't put mulch right against the stems of plants, because now the mulch is trapping moisture and humidity there, and fungi and bacteria and rodents and everything else can now get to that trunk. Do not put the moisture against the trunks of trees and shrubs. For your garden plants, right against the trunk, okay? They moderate air temperature. One of the problems that you have with mulches is you can have a fire hazard. In the South, they use pine needles all over the place. Longleaf pine is actually one of the price of longleaf pine needles has gone skyrocketed lately because longleaf pine needles are the best needle to use for mulch. Other pine needles don't work as well. It's just an interesting little mulch note. But you get rodents with mulch. And now they like to eat your bark of your plants. So depending on the mulch that you bring in, you have to think about fire hazard, maybe mulch. Some mulches might be a little toxic. Hemlock would not be a good mulch. Hemlock has a lot of tannins and resins in its bark. If you've ever seen a hemlock in the woods, the hemlock wood decomposes, and a lot of times the bark's lying there. It has so many tannins and resins that it actually can be a problem to decomposition, or it might have so many toxins. Same with some of your fresh cedar mulches. The cedar mulch that you buy is usually composted a little. If you use fresh cedar, it would probably cause a problem with the chemicals leaching out of it into your soil. So if you're going to use your own mulch, just make sure it's composted a little bit. And in some cases, you might affect rooting depth in that if you put a mulch down too thick and around the trunks of trees and things like that, they'll produce adventitious roots through the mulch and won't go into the ground. Because if you have really heavy ground and you have good mulch on top, the roots will go into the mulch. And then in the summer, when you have drought, mulch dries up. So mulches are almost always beneficial. Here's a simple mulch that I use, your Christmas trees.
Oh, yeah.
Christmas trees are a great mulch. Take the branches and just, this is my onions from last year. Why is that a great mulch, especially for perennial gardens? Really, really good for perennial gardens. There's airspace, there's moisture, there's a little bit of acid from the needles. It protects the ground from the sun. It protects the ground from freeze thaw. And you just pick them up in the spring and the needles fall off and you just leave the needles there for nutrient improvement. So that just got cleaned up recently in my garden. And that's my onions and they should be ready in a few weeks. Pretty simple. What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't go through and clean the leaves up yet because we're still getting this bouncing around at temperatures. Here's a field that was planted with sunflowers. The really good thing about the sunflowers is we use them for cut flowers. Literally, this was a 4th of July planting. Go through rototill, get birdseed, that black oil sunflower birdseed from the store, throw it on top of the ground, rake it in a little bit, and see if it grows. Great benefit. And then at the end of the year, we just rototilled the thing in. And we got a lot of organic matter from it. One of the problems that you had when you cut it down, rats. There's so much food there.
Yeah.
That when the varmints left there, they would want to go into a cow barn or they'd want to find another place where they can find another warm place to hang out. But good improvement. This is scoop and dump. Instead of rototilling, there's a lot of work, but take the soil in the fall, flip it over. So the grass is underneath and just let it sit all winter. And next spring, it's ready to go. Scoop and dump. By just scooping and dumping, you're not breaking the structure up much. So I think I do have another video I wanted to show. Let me see if I can find it.
Now, scooping and dumping, you do that in the fall?
I recommend it in the fall, but that picture actually I did this spring.
Oh, okay.
Because I just didn't get around to it in the fall. Here's my cell phone. If you take a sponge and you squeeze it and you sink it down into water and you bring it out of the water, it will drain a little bit, but it won't drain much. If you take that sponge and turn it sideways, so do this at home, take the sponge and turn it sideways, water will come pouring out of that sponge. Now take your sponge and flip it this way and the water will stop. If you take a your sponge, flip it back this way again, it'll start running again. If you turn it this way, it'll run even more. Now, why does that happen? Because water runs through things due to gravity. So if the gravity column is short, there's a short gravity column, it won't drain. A long gravity column, it'll drain, and a longer gravity column, because I turned it on its
And here's
diagonal,
the
it
example
drains
of
even
the
more.
sponge.
So
Saturate
how does
it
that
with
relate to
water,
your soil depth?
turn it so the water drains out. That's the long drainage column. Flatten it. That's the short drainage column. Long drainage, the water comes out because of gravity. Short drainage, saturated, but it dries out quickly.
Why does this sandy soil that I showed you early on at the beach drain so well? Why does Middleburg Valley drain so well? Because the soil depth is a constant column. There's no layers, and the water will pull all the way through that long column. What's the problem that some of you have with your heavy soils?
Short column.
Short column, and underneath you have bedrock, or maybe you have gravel, but it's a layer. So the only way to fix that is build it up, work with what you have. Why do raised beds work so well? Because in a raised bed, I can decide if so here's another comparison. Why does soil work really well in your garden? And it would be the worst thing to put in a pot to grow petunias. If you put soil in a pot, it turns into concrete. That's all about the soil column length. So you do not compare growing containers to growing in the ground. I've seen some really, really great nursery professionals that are really great at growing trees in a nursery, and they're awful at growing container plants because they don't understand the container plant. You understand, how do I grow in the ground? The person that's a greenhouse grower, they're probably a terrible field grower. Unless you have experience watering. What's the first thing that they teach a person to do in a greenhouse? Water. Talking about pore space. Roots grow in pore space. So
Well, I was just about to fill all my containers with soil in the garden. Not a good idea.
Well, that may not be a true statement, because if your garden is really, really organic and really, really porous, it might work. But is your soil in your garden dirt?
No, it's pretty much from the bottom of my compost pile.
So the beginning of the discussion was, what's the difference between dirt and soil? Dirt's got bad things in it. So the question is, when you're growing in a pot, you have more chance of, if a top thrower rot, you have more chances of bad microbes. But if you got really well-developed compost that's been processed properly, you got great container material. So it may work really well in your pot.
Okay.
Just don't add any clay to it. I had a few questions that I had put up, so let me share those with you. This was kind of the last slide, I think. So can you see those?
Mhm.
So I'll just go through those really quick. Is a soil test helpful?
Yes.
My answer is, I just want to know what I have. If it says I'm low in magnesium, am I going to add magnesium? Well, probably not. I'll go out and buy some Epsom salts and I'll try, or whatever. But I want to know the pH. That's what I get from that. If I know I have a lot of calcium and my magnesium's upset and my phosphorus is too high, the really things that come out of a soil test, there's nitrogen's not a good measure on a soil test because nitrogen's variable. It leaches out. We just know we need to be adding nitrogen in some form. I want to know the pH. And I want to know what's my sand, silt, and clay and how much organic matter. So pH, that's what I want to know. Because I probably know everything else I need to know about my little hand ribbon test that I've done. Hemlocks grow in swamps. Do you plant them in wet areas? Absolutely not. If you've ever walked through a swampy area, how do most of the plants grow? They're growing on hummocks. They're growing on hills. So you want to grow hemlocks, they need air and water. Hemlocks are plants that grow along streams where the water's running by, or they have their roots up on hummocks. You walk through Landis Arboretum's hemlock areas and their roots are right on top of the ground. They want air. Don't plant them in your soggy, wet swamp. Okay. Why won't blueberries work for me? Well, in Schoharie County, our pH is too high. But guess what? I have a blueberry swamp across the street. What the heck are they doing in the blueberry swamp? A Schoharie County blueberry will probably grow in Schoharie County soils. So if I buy a South Jersey blueberry that's grown in an acid swamp, it's not going to work in Schoharie County. But it might work in the Pine Barrens. So it's more about pH. Is city water okay to water with? The hint is you drink it. Sure, city water's fine. They put chlorine in city water. Is chlorine bad for plants? Well, if I'm a root, I don't want bacteria and fungi attacking me. So the chlorine will get rid of those. It's if they have too much chlorine, like swimming pool chlorine, that may be too much chlorine, but city water's fine. Is well water okay? Well, my well water comes out of karst limestone. My well water is really sweet. But how about reservoir water around here? If the reservoir is getting water from a hemlock woodland or a pine woodland, I'll bet you the water in the reservoir is acid. So your reservoir water might be better. We're talking pH. Right. Why might peat moss help a damp or heavy soil? Most people would say, don't add peat moss to a heavy soil. It's the sponge, it expands, it gives space. Add something that gives space. Does now cover. Does snow cover help gardens? Absolutely. Take your snow blower and blow snow on your garden. The snow actually has a little bit of nitrogen in it. The snow will protect the microbes. The snow will protect it from what I call yin yang, bouncing up and down the temperatures. Why won't soil work for potted plants? It will in Ann's garden. Why do raised beds help? So that's what I have. But soil components, sand, silt, and clay. Hopefully you got that. Plants need structure, space to grow, water, nutrients, microbes, and you are a part of your soil. So how should I be watering this plant? I should use slower water, not pounding on the top and all the water's bouncing off. I should run it slow onto the pot surface, not fast, because when I put it down fast, it will compact the media. And it may only, this type of water only waters the top of the plant. And the water's got to travel down the branches to get to the roots. So you're better off watering inside. Anyway, we'll take questions.
This is somewhat related to your topic. When you buy trees and large bushes in nurseries, the root ball is in burlap. Do you recommend cutting the burlap when you plant it or leaving it intact?
The usual recommendation, if the burlap's really bulky, you got to get rid of the bulk. So sometimes they have these heavy bulks with knots tied on top. You got to get rid of that piece. So a lot of people will just recommend cutting the top layer of burlap off and then putting the rest of the plant in the ground. To me, I usually put the burlap in the ground, but if I can get it off, I get it off. The question is, if you can take the burlap off without disturbing the root ball.
Mm-hmm.
If the root ball is disturbed, don't take the burlap off. Let it naturally decompose because you're doing more damage to the plant. One of the interesting things with trees and shrubs that's a little different from your vegetable garden is trees and shrubs have to grow out of their problems. Like they have to photosynthesize to grow roots. So in a lot of cases, we think we're helping by taking the burlap off. Well, if you just broke the root system, you can't get nutrients and water to the top of the plant. So the answer to that is, yes, take it off if you're not going to disturb the roots. Similar to, I have a poor, let's say, blueberry growing in my yard. I want to help my blueberry. I think I'll dig it up and move it.
Oh,
Okay,
no.
think about that. I got this person that's in the hospital. They're not healthy. Let's unhook them from all the stuff and move them somewhere else to a place that maybe that won't help them either. The plant must grow out of its own problem, and that means it has to photosynthesize. Adding fertilizer will not fix my blueberry. Maybe changing the pH, maybe mulching around it, but don't dig it up. And so you have to think holistically of, I have a problem. So the one issue with trees and shrubs is we have to deal with them in place. And when we put them in that place, we're stuck with them in that place.
And a related question then, when you buy plants from a nursery or someplace that are in a pot, when you remove the pot, the roots are all wound and bound, what we usually call root bound. Should
Right.
you roughen those up or just put the plant in without the pot and leave it compacted like it comes in as it comes out of the pot?
You should break those roots up. If I'm going to buy a plant, I don't want to see that it's root bound. In most cases, they're going to be in some way. What if I pull it out of the pot and I find it's root bound, I need to cut off those root bound roots. Now I'm damaging the plant, but I'm damaging it for its own benefit. And when you take it out, let's say you take a plant, and here's the problem. In the 1950s, they started growing container plants. And what we just talked about was, do we put soil in a pot? Initially, they put soil in pots and it didn't work. So they went to, most of your medias today are pine bark medias. Douglas fir, they're pine bark, they're all bark with a little bit of sand and maybe some peat moss. Okay, I'm going to put that in my clay soil. So what happens when I put it in my clay soil? When it's got, the roots are like, this is beautiful. This is a beautiful place for me to be. There's room for my roots. And then you put it in a heavy clay soil. The problem with a container plant is the container media never matches the soil. Never. So you have to modify the root system. You have to rough it up a little bit to get the roots out into your soil. And you have to add organic matter to the soil, because you might have 90% bark in your pot and you have no bark in your soil. The problem that you then may get to is the roots will get out to where the bark is mixed in your soil, and that won't go any farther. And then it goes up into your mulch. The container plant delivers many problems, but it grows in faster and then it slows down over time. Bulb and burlap plant grows in slower, but it lasts longer.
Is that the same with the seed plant versus the container plant?
I don't know what you mean by a seed plant, like a bare root plant?
Yeah, well, when you go to the the Arboretum and buy lettuce and tomatoes and stuff, would you be just as far ahead if you put seeds in?
Yes,
Because your seeds will catch up anyway,
right.
and they're acclimated to your own soil.
Yes. Yeah. So we all, all plants need that initial, I need this baby soil. I need this like really good, it's got smaller pore spaces because it's got to have water around it. It's got to have aeration. And then the roots start to branch out into your native soil. So in many cases where you're putting a plant grown in just a potting media into a soil, it doesn't root out. If you have a choice of planting a bare root plant from Oregon versus a bald and burlap plant from Oregon, give me the bare root one. Oregon soil is totally different than ours. I take that plant out of its native soil there and put it in our soil here, and the roots are all surrounded by native soil. It takes longer for it to adjust, but once it's adjusted, it's there. It's like, I'm happy. So as opposed to circling around and around in a hole, if you take a plant out of a pot, don't amend the soil around the plant, don't break up the root system and just put it in the ground, you'll find it dead 2 years later. It might make it a year, it might make it 2 years, then it'll be dead.
I have a question about legumes. They're nitrogen fixing.
Right.
It's I like to leave legumes like clover and crown vetch in among my garden, thinking that that probably helps the soil, and the color's nice too.
Right, right. And you're actually helping with soil depth, because the legumes tend, the alfalfas and the clovers and those things actually will have pretty good deep searching roots that will actually break the soils up. A lot of farmers will plant alfalfa in their fields simply because the alfalfa root likes to go deep. And it's actually like a subsoiler. It'll break the soil and open it. It's I don't know about the crown vetch and the clover's a little more surface, but again, you're improving soil structure and airspace, and you're giving more nutrient holding by having an environment that bacteria really like. So there's a win-win there. The lose-lose with the crown vetches, it might grow over everything.
We once had a plant science student here. He lived with us, and he wanted to help us out in the spring when the lawn looked pretty awful. So he was going to get special grass seed, and I said, please be sure to include some white clover. I like the bees and I like the color. He went ballistic. What? I spend my life getting rid of white clover.
And you look at white clover and it just has a capacity to grow where other things don't grow. And in its little bit of life where it's growing, it's so persistent, it's adding to the good environment underground. It's very aggressive where other things are. So you have to consider, is it too aggressive for what I want? You get purslane in your garden in the summertime when it's so hot, you're just pulling purslane out all over the place. Purslane's a bane of mine. Yeah, you can eat it, but I can only eat so much. Anything else? Yeah, I hadn't looked at the chat.
Thank you. It was great.
All right.
No, thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I think I might, I'm going to go out for a walk before I do any gardening.
Sounds like a plan.
All right. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.